There's this like mentality around the NHS. I think it is quite sad because when something's wrong, I just think I don't want to be adding to that waiting line when maybe someone who needs it more, will have to wait longer. So there's like sort of like guilt of even phoning up. A case of this is, for example, like my grandma. While she was alive, I remember her having like a certain sense of guilt actually, even just calling an ambulance, because again, like there's so many people who might need it more, and my mum would have to like nag her, and it's like, even if she's like fallen down the stairs or something, she'd feel bad.
Everybody, and welcome back to Undoctrination. My name's Maggie, and this week I have my wonderful friend here all the way from the UK, Jess Gill. Welcome to the studio. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
Awesome. And why don't you just introduce yourself to the audience, people who may not have heard of you yet?
Yeah, so I'm a political commentator, I think you could say, or a content creator. I started out on TikTok making political videos, and over the past 2 years, it has been great, having this engagement and dialogue with people. And I've joined various liberty organisations like FEE. I'm the social media manager of Lola, and I'm also the host of Reasons UK, one of the main hosts, where we create political content. And I also write for various platforms like FEE, Mises, The Critic.
Wow, super, super busy. And how old are you?
20.
Oh my gosh. So when did you start doing TikToks?
During lockdown, for one, I quite liked the green screen feature. I thought that was so cool. And I just saw so much misinformation by young people, where it's really great they have a platform, obviously. It's really great that young people are so passionate about politics. But I disagree with what they said, and I didn't think there was a pro-free market perspective on a lot of these issues, and they lacked nuance. So I thought, hey, why don't I do this? Why don't I be the person to bring that counter perspective?
Absolutely. And for those of you tuning in today, we wanted to talk about the NHS, or the National Health Service, right? Which is the state-run healthcare system in the UK. But I did want to ask, what was COVID and the lockdowns, what were those like in the UK? Because a lot of us in the US have a very similar experience. And I was wondering, was it longer, shorter, more status, less status?
Yeah, so for an extended period of time, we weren't even allowed outside our house. Like, we had a ban on how many times we could go on a walk a day. Even
Are you
like
serious?
In the park. Yeah.
How many walks were you allowed?
1 walk a day.
1 walk a day?
And you could only go with like people in your family. And
oh my gosh.
There was like regulation on who could go into shops and everything, as I'm sure there was in the US. But also the schools were shut down, and this really impacted learning. And when you were allowed into school, you had to wear a face mask, which I remember, because it's very raining in the UK, as I'm sure you're aware. There was like panels on the roof, and the rain was pattering down, and then I had a face mask on. So when I was answering questions for the teacher, like I had to like shout so loud, so no one could hear anything. It was so chaotic.
Were you still? I don't know quite what the UK school system is like. Were you in kind of the equivalent of high school at the time?
I was in sixth form college, which is 16 to 18.
Okay, yeah. So exactly. Oh my gosh, that must have been horrible. Yeah, and as far as the regulations on shops go, did they have like a specific schedule that you could go to shops? Like specific times? I know that they had that in other countries.
Oh, I didn't know they had it in other countries. No, it was just like there were massive queues, which probably led to more people like coming into contact with each other. Now that I think back to it, like, do you guys have Tesco here?
No, is that like a grocery store?
Yeah, it's like a grocery store, and I remember there was like massive queues to get into the Tesco because like everyone was just waiting, and that was so surreal. But at the time, I don't know about you, but for me it didn't seem like it was this big thing. It was just like, oh, okay, gotta stay in my house for a few months, no big deal. But looking back on it, it's so insane what the government put us through.
Yeah, it really was. And I'm assuming you were under 18 at the time.
Yeah.
Had you been involved in politics at all up to that point?
I always had an interest in politics, and I was doing politics at A-level, like one of the classes. And it's really funny. I think COVID actually radicalised a lot of people and changed their political views, because I remember I was still figuring out where I stood. I was a member of Labour at the time, the left-wing party.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that, actually. That's
Many
so
such
funny.
cases.
Every person we invite on the show is like, yep, I used to be left-wing, because I used to be left-wing too. And our friend Salome last week, she used to be left-wing as well. That's so funny. Oh my goodness. Okay, so how did you go from Labour to the Conservative Party?
I think over lockdown I just did a lot more research onto it. I always had this intuition, like, it's quite embarrassing. The way I started out into politics, I first watched Oxford Union debates, which is a lot more, like, intellectual than, like, what followed that, which was me being obsessed with Ben Shapiro videos.
I know exactly the phase you're describing.
Yeah.
I think we all went through it, you know? Just like Ben Shapiro owns this college student, and yeah, I completely understand.
Yeah, so I went through that phase, but I thought because I'm Northern, I'm working class, I go to a state school, which is a government-funded, government-run school, then I must, well, it's a safer bet to be on Labour, you know, be on the left, because they're the good side. So I thought, you know, I might as well start there, get involved in politics. What better time to start than now? But I never thought I was a socialist or anything.
Okay.
And this was during 2019. And I remember when Boris won, and part of me, all my other class in my politics class, they were conservative, because no one's conservative in the UK. And they were like cheering, and it was really funny, but inside me I was like, yes, Boris Johnson won, which was a later disappointment. But after lockdown, they were all left-wing, and I was the only conservative.
That is so interesting. I wonder what goes into the psychology behind that, because essentially the government made us all prisoners without any of us having committed a crime, because we were locked in our homes. I think in the UK or wherever it was that you were living, was the housing way more dense over there than it is in the US?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and it was a big college as well.
Okay.
So there were a lot of people. I think what it was that the people in my class, at least, and I think the majority of the country, had this view of conservatism through Boris Johnson, and Partygate happened, and everyone wasn't happy with the government during lockdown. So the hype around Boris Johnson just faded. And also just like BLM, that led to not just a rise in like, what's it called? Like,
Left-wing
race relations
activism.
and left-wing activism, but also a rise in like socialists. Like I remember so many infographics. Like one thing that really annoyed me and got me really invested in politics, wanting to like become an activist almost, was that I remember seeing stories, Instagram stories of girls in my year who were like, okay, they were like NPCs in my class.
Right, yes.
But I remember them posting infographics of like very divisive things like Cal Rittenhouse, things like saying he's a terrorist and all that kind of stuff. And I remember having a conversation with this girl, and she just wouldn't engage in good faith to me, and this is somebody I've known for 5 years. And then she was just like, oh, you wouldn't get it. And then she was like, anyway, I'm going. And then she put like BLM, ACAB, justice for Breonna Taylor, like all this stuff. And it's like, you're in Britain. Like, it's not even America. And what really annoyed me was another girl. She posted this story of a police officer, like doxing a police officer, saying this police officer was responsible for this, like inciting violence against BLM activists. Whereas I just did a very quick Google search, and it was proven to be incorrect. Like it was fake news. It was debunked by like multiple platforms. Like I know fact checkers are a bit iffy, but you know. And I just messaged her. I was like, oh, this is wrong, and she just didn't reply. And I just thought this post had millions of likes, and I just hate to imagine what this person, this police officer, is going through. Like this misinformation, and people aren't thinking about it. They're just so keen to virtue signal. I think that's really awful.
It's really interesting because that was happening in the US as well. I mean, I think it's so interesting that American political problems get exported overseas, because I saw that happening, BLM protests in European countries. And I wasn't quite sure, like, are you mad at UK police? Are you mad at American police? Like, what are we protesting? I always felt like part of the success of the BLM movement here was that it provided an opportunity for people to take out some of the anger that they had been building up over COVID and lash out at a morally acceptable enemy. Like that is what rang true to me as I was witnessing that, because I did attend some rallies in summer of 2020 because I believe in certain criminal justice reforms, but also because this was like a very big historical event, right? We had been locked inside for a few months. And what I was saying about density, police weren't able to enforce real lockdowns in the US. Like, they could shut down stores, and that's really how they got us here, but they couldn't force you to be inside your home. So like a lot of us were, you know, driving to our friends' houses, and we were doing pods, like the social pods before it was cool, you know? But yeah, I did attend a few, and the first one I attended was in Houston because I was living in Austin, Texas at the time. And this happened to be where George Floyd's family was. And I think it was maybe 18 or 19,000 people showed up that day, packed like sardines. I mean, we were outside. But the running narrative at the time was that COVID was killing people, and yet here were 18,000 people around me, and I was like, this doesn't seem to add up. Was it kind of similar in the UK? Did people come out of their houses and protest?
Yeah, the same people who were complaining about lockdown were the same people going out and protesting, which I don't think it makes any sense, because the issue of race is like so much different between the US and the UK with the background and everything. And so we had us been like, for example, there was a statue of Colston, who was, I think he's from Bristol, and he was a well-known philanthropist. Like, he built Bristol pretty much.
Yeah.
And he was involved in the slave trade. I think there's nuance around it. But they had his statue like torn down, which like I don't know how I feel about that, because that is like property, and I'm not for damaging property. And there was calls for like removing statues all around the UK, including a Churchill statue. A Churchill statue got vandalised, and that was like heavily protected by police.
Wow.
But it just seems so strange. And another thing as well around this time was the death of the murder of Sarah Everard. I'm not sure if you're aware who that is.
Who is that?
So I think the whole BLM stuff hyped people up to protest. And what happened, it was really awful. And a police officer, this is around police brutality, but it was more of a feminist approach to it, because I think she was basically murdered and raped by a police officer. And there was like a search, and they found her body, and that really like incited protest for a rightful cause. I think that's justified. And but the issue is something like that. I don't know if you remember on TikTok where there was this like kill all men phase.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do remember this.
And I remember also a TikTok trend where it's like put a finger down off like the different types of sexual assault you've experienced, like catcalling, all that stuff. And I was like, a bit weird to make it into a trend. But I think there's a way to go about these topics. But the way we're doing it, because sexual harassment and protecting women are important topics to discuss, so is how we treat racial minorities. That's an important issue to discuss. Of course, there's racism and sexism going on.
Yeah.
But the way these topics were handled, it was really awful.
It was very self-serving, I think, for a lot of people. Yeah, there were a lot of really unfortunate social media trends that came out of that time. And like I said, I was there at several protests, not like the crazy ones, but like the really peaceful ones. And I had this sign that was like, here are the criminal justice reforms that I want to see. But there were so many social media trends. Like there was the blackout square trend. where people felt like a significant amount of pressure. And there was this feeling of like, oh, well, if I don't post this, you know, people are checking my profile. And if they see I didn't post this, then that means that I'm this. And it was a weird social coercion that was happening. And I'm curious, like, how you, during this time of heightened social pressure to become a leftist, and that was happening in the US and the UK, it sounds like, how did you end up finding your own footing and becoming more of an independent thinker?
I think, I mean, I've never been one to, I know this sounds like very like cliche and everything, but I'm very much for doing things because they're right, not because they're popular.
Right.
Like the whole trans stuff, I understand, and I'm very much an advocate for advocating for women's rights in that, or women's freedoms in that capacity. But what really annoyed me at the start was the whole pronoun debate. Like, that didn't make sense to me. I was just like, I'm not gonna say something if I don't think it's true. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So it's just been off that and having these discussions and debates through TikTok. I think lockdown actually did some good in that regard, because I didn't have to face my peers every day. And
Right.
I got comments of people I know through school on my TikTok saying like, oh, you're awful. Like, people who went to my college while I was there, and I was like, I'm so glad I don't have to face you every day at class.
Yeah.
So it did give some distance, and it allowed me to platform my voice, platform my views without facing real life social backlash, because it's relatively easy to ignore a comment on a TikTok, especially like with TikTok, the algorithm, everyone comments, so
Yeah.
it's less of a big deal. Whereas in real life, like, I remember when lockdowns finally started to ease, going back, I felt kind of paranoid because I felt like people like turning and whispering about me, and nothing like came of it. And I didn't actually lose any friends from that, but I just felt kind of awkward.
Yeah.
And there were conversations. I remember having this conversation with this girl about Churchill and the Bengal famine, because there was this idea that Churchill caused the Bengal famine, which is just not true. It's due to like geography reasons and also the war causing economic chaos. And I tried to have a conversation with her, and she just blocked me straight away. And on the last day of school, it's kind of embarrassing. I remember crying because I was saying like goodbye to all my teachers. Like, I was just very emotional at the time. And I ran to the toilet just like to try and like save face. And she was there, and it took me a second to realise who she was, but she was really nice to me. I don't think she realised who I was. So it's just so interesting to see someone being so dogmatic and, I don't want to say cruel, but not willing to have a conversation to you over social media. But this girl being so nice, so understanding in person.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a function of social media. It takes away some of the sting of people coming after you, because it does remove that layer of like human-to-human contact. Everything feels very robotic. But yeah, it also does encourage cruelty from people. So I can definitely see that. I think you probably were just very, you were very strong in those moments, because I know a lot of people cannot handle like negative comments on social media and bend or crack immediately. I do relate to the feeling of social paranoia. Like, we were just talking about this. I definitely have had trouble with like old friends who I really want to reconnect with, who knew me when I was way more lefty, and like worrying that they think I'm a different person now because my understanding of politics has changed. So I can understand that. And I have definitely avoided some like in-person conferences and this and that, just because I'm like, oh gosh, they're gonna be whispering about me. But I feel like, you know, having to go back into that situation might have eased some of that, because, you know, you kind of had to. It was school. But so during COVID, our healthcare system was allegedly overrun. Although that, I don't know. I feel like we were able to get a lot of medical supplies pretty quickly. How did the NHS in the UK fare during all of this?
It is hard to tell because there was also, not to go like theory, but the economic calculation problem and the knowledge problem, the NHS really suffers with that because it's so centralised, they can't allocate resources. And so that was a massive issue. Like, there was Nightingale hospitals, which were sometimes empty. And at the same time, people who wanted normal treatment for, like, cancer checkups, they were put on a backlog. So now we have, I think it's like 7 million people on a backlog. And bear in mind, the UK is like, I think it's like 65 million people. So that's a big number of people who aren't able to seek treatment because of this.
And that's still a problem?
Yeah, we're still dealing with the effects of it. And I think with the NHS, the lockdowns were used to justify, the NHS was used to justify the lockdowns. Like, stay inside to protect your grandma and save the NHS. Like, do this to save the NHS. And one thing that was really weird to me was, like, every week we would go outside and clap for the NHS. Like, me and my sister, we were sort of like, is this real? Because I heard about it on Twitter and I was like, Steph, they're doing this. And she was like, surely not. And
That's
so
really funny.
at like 7 p.m, we opened the window and we could hear like people like banging on pans, clapping.
So it was real?
Yeah.
Was it everywhere?
It was everywhere.
Oh my gosh.
And the Prime Minister did it. Everyone was doing it. It was so crazy. And so there was that mentality, save the NHS, it's the idea of, sacrificing freedom for safety to the maximum.
Wow. Yeah. What's interesting, you told me that the NHS was started, was it after the Second
the Second World War?
And that same messaging was used to recruit younger and younger men to go fight in these wars that seemingly had no point, right? To go fight and die. So yeah, that's really interesting, like sacrificing for this like greater good, but I'm not sure that the NHS is all that great. So how did the NHS get started? Because in America, I don't know. Our healthcare system is interesting because it's mixed, right? There is a lot of government intervention within the healthcare system, which does cause some like artificial price increases. And in general, healthcare is kind of a stressful thing for Americans, although we have a lot more freedom and choice and shorter waiting times and really incredible doctors want to come here and innovation happens here. But there is this deep desire to give all of that away, throw that out the window so we can get free healthcare. What was the motivating factor in the UK?
I think it was after the war. For one, England, or Britain in general, has sort of had a reshaping since the Second World War because of the empire. We don't know how to address the empire, for example. Like, we don't talk about it at all in our history lessons.
Really?
Yeah, it's just like something we don't talk about.
That's so interesting.
And I think the NHS was sort of a replacement of trying to find Britain's identity. I think that was one of the leading things. And also this general idea of community, I think wanting to get together through that. And like Mises talks about how socialism was rising in the UK. It wasn't just the NHS. Like, there was strong housing targets, which were quite big percentage of it was public housing, which in history lessons we're taught is a good thing. That's a big part of it was social housing.
Yeah.
And now I'm thinking, nah.
Probably not.
Probably not. But there was just this general attitude towards socialism, I think, after the war. And which is weird because I think most people I think there was a poll by Dr. Christian Niemitz, who works for the Institute of Economic Affairs. He does a lot of work on the NHS, or why the NHS sucks. And one of the things in his book, Universal Healthcare Without the NHS, he states how British people didn't even really want the NHS. It wasn't even that popular to begin with. And it's interesting because it was also the Conservative Party who put forward one of the first proposals for the NHS, but it was under Attlee's government.
Why do you think they were pursuing NHS funding?
I think, the Conservative Party, after the war and probably during the war as well, they the thing is with the Conservative Party, as shown by today, they don't really have any principles or ideology. Like, I really hate the term pragmatism because it just means, like, where are you going in that? I think ideology is a good thing, but the Conservative Party lack that. There's this thing called, and I'm not sure if the US is similar, but there's this post-war consensus where from the after the Second World War until Thatcher, there was Keynesian economics being implemented and high social spending. Trade unions were a massive issue, and things got so bad in the UK. There was this, we call it the winter of discontent, where the bin men were on protest. I don't know what you guys call it. Bin men. Garbage collectors, maybe. I don't know.
Bin man. Oh, that's so cute.
But
bin men.
Everyone was on protest. The miners were on strike. Ted Heath, I think it was a 3-day working week because they couldn't afford it. Like, that's the impact of socialism.
A 3-day working week?
Yeah, I think it was a 3-day working week. And that led to so many issues. And they think of Thatcher as this bad guy, to be fair. I think Thatcher was sort of overrated. She didn't do... The left make her sound way cooler than she actually was.
Right, by it trying to make her a villain, they make her sound cooler.
Oh, she wanted to privatise everything. She wanted to privatise the NHS. Like, I wish. Yeah.
Incredible.
But she did make some big changes, and it was needed. She didn't do it for no reason. She did it because the economy was really plummeting, and it wasn't making anyone happy. Like, people have this idea of the economy being separate. Like, oh, you just care about the economy. You don't care about people. But the economy is people. It's how it affects everyone's lives. Like, there is no, like, difference. It's not just benefiting the rich. It's how these policies impact other people. And Thatcher, like, the North, for example, I'm Northern. The North had a big mining industry, and Thatcher's notorious for closing all the mines. For one, she didn't close more mines than most of the other prime ministers. I think Attlee closed more mines than her. But...
What do you mean by closing the mines?
So I think the mines were nationalised.
Okay.
And because it wasn't a very profitable... Also, it's less like, who wants to work in the mines as well? Like, it's not a very good condition.
It's a horrible job.
Yeah.
It's terrible working conditions, very dangerous.
Bad for the environment. I'm sure Extinction Rebellion would be protesting if it was around today.
There's going to be orange paint all over the mines.
But back to the NHS. I'm not sure. I think there was just a general push towards socialism in general. I think that was the main issue. And just over time, people had this idea. But throughout the years, I think there's been, since the 80s, there's been this idea that the Tories are trying to privatise the NHS, or Labour as well. Like, Christian Nemitz references, he's a really good tweeter. I advise anyone to check out his Twitter. Like, he really roasts communists. Like, he just bullies communists. It's
Incredible.
So funny.
Somebody's got to do it.
It's so iconic. But he showed a picture of, I think it was the Times, although I could be wrong, but, like, this old newspaper saying the Tories are going to privatise the NHS. This is a move towards American healthcare. And then there's one, like, last week or, like, a month ago where they're saying they're going to privatise the NHS. It's just, like, you'd think after, like, 4 decades they would have done it already.
It's kind of like the end of the world predictions. Like, we keep predicting the end of the world, like, is going to happen because of climate change, and that's going to happen a decade from now. And then we arrive at that time, and it gets pushed back again. Yeah. And you were telling me earlier it doesn't seem like the Tories, and Tories is synonymous with conservative, right? It doesn't seem like the Tories are making any moves to privatize the NHS, even though a lot of people in the past were against the formation of the NHS and socialized healthcare. Nowadays, it seems like everyone is in favor universally, despite having issues with it. So can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, so there is, like, a massive cult mentality around the NHS. Like, it was its 75th anniversary about a month ago, and instead of going to Prime Minister's questions, Rishi Sunak and the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, they went to a ceremony like at a cathedral, like, celebrating the NHS, and there were, like, choir children singing how much, like, they love the NHS, singing happy birthday to the NHS.
Like a religion.
Yeah, it is literally like a religion. I think it might have been Nigel Lawson, although I could be wrong, who said the NHS is the closest thing to a state religion. And that just gets more true every day. And with the NHS, the thing is, it's such a terrible system, the waiting lists are long, like, everyone's saying it's it's free at the point of use, but what's the point of it being free at the point of use if you can't even get around to using it? It is ridiculous. And when you criticise it, you're accused of trying to, you don't care about the poor, you want it to go to a US-style system, which I'm for a completely privatised system. Like, I think the European models are too socialist for my liking. But even so, if we were going to go towards a more market-based system, it wouldn't be like the US anyway. It would be more like Germany or the Scandinavian model and that kind of stuff, where it's more of a insurance-based system. Or like Singapore has a very good market-based system. So it wouldn't be like, the US. And the US has its own problems, which is caused by the state, which people don't talk about enough. Or like it is caused by regulation of like doctors and who can like patents and that kind of stuff, and just the general incentive towards insurance with which I found out about at Mises University, which I attended recently, that because employers wanted to give their workers a benefit, instead of paying them extra, they'd which would be taxed by income tax, they'd just give them healthcare insurance, which wasn't taxed, so that increased that incentive. But if you're not personally paying for it, you have less of an incentive to really look at the paycheck. So that's why US healthcare is so expensive. So there's issues with the US system, of course, but just because you want reform, it doesn't mean you're advocating for the US system. And so if you say you want to abolish or even reform, no one's talking about abolition. I'm talking about abolition, but no one else is.
You gotta drive that Overton window towards abolition, though.
Yeah, everyone's just like, maybe we need some market-based reform. Like, no, abolish it, privatise it. And you're accused of also hating the poor, hating people who have diabetes and that kind of stuff. And also there's this sort of... I don't get, like, they don't understand the contradiction, because on one side the NHS is the envy of the world and everyone wants to copy the NHS, whereas no one's actually copying it. But besides that point, and if they do finally concede that there is issues with the NHS, it's because the Tories are privatising it and underfunding it. The NHS has never had more funding. It's increasing its funding every year. And also, it's OECD average. It doesn't have like remarkably low funding. And also, really, do we really want to be pumping so much money into the NHS? Surely if it was that great of a system, it would be not underfunded, but it wouldn't be like so heavily funded, because it would be so efficient.
Yeah.
Like, prices should go down, but it just doesn't.
It's like imagining if our healthcare system was like the DMV, like everything's super slow moving. You have to wait in insanely long lines. I can't imagine. It seems like Canada also imported that socialized healthcare system, and they're seeing even more problems because now they have legalized euthanasia. And so the healthcare system in Canada is now incentivizing people to, unalive themselves so they don't have to fund this anymore. And that is like a serious danger of socialized healthcare. I know that there have been a few stories coming out of the UK where, young kids have either super rare or very degenerative diseases that are deadly. And because the UK isn't pursuing these super experimental treatments, they can't get treated in the UK. And also the UK doesn't want to fund those things. But also the UK has been denying petitions for these families to take their kids overseas to seek treatment. Why do you think that is? I don't understand.
I think it's just this general idea of the NHS being the best source of authority around healthcare. And, well, the issue is people don't like to think of it as rationing, but it's literally rationing. Like, they have to prioritise certain things. And when you criticise the NHS, it's not the doctors or nurses that you're criticising. And it's not, like, politicians in general. Like, I think politicians are incompetent, but I don't think they're trying to kill us. Maybe, but...
Some of them might be, but we don't know that for sure.
But I think with these things was extremely difficult moral dilemmas. And of where funding should go towards, like you said, with the euthanasia part, but also with like trans stuff. Like when the state determines like political issues, like there is a political aspect in medical care. One thing that the UK, the NHS recently disbanded to a local level, but it was a massive issue, was the Tavistock Clinic, which is a child transgender clinic, where they were rushing because of the waiting list, because of the backlog of everyone thinking that they're trans all of a sudden. There were so many young people wanting to go on like puberty blockers, and that was just fast-tracked. There's this really good book called Time to Think, where it basically, there's this idea that puberty blockers give young people time to think about their gender.
Yeah, it's like pressing pause on puberty, right?
Which is really
With
not true.
no bad outcomes.
Which is really not true, because it just, like, it confirms it and it makes them double down on it. When in reality, I think, even if you identify as trans, I don't think it's something, you don't want people to go through surgery when they don't have to. So if there's a possibility of them not having to go through that and maybe just go through, normal puberty, that should be a preferred option. But they're trying to get rid of that. And also, the Tavistock Clinic and the NHS and the government in general are being pressured by this group called Mermaids, which is a child transgender group. It was also partnered with Starbucks as well. Yeah. And
what?
Yeah. And they're pressuring doctors, for example, to not question a child's gender. Like, if you say, are you sure you think you're the opposite gender, that would be illegal under what they want. So that's another issue of a state-run healthcare system.
Because it's abusive to ask questions, right? That's not affirming
It's conversion
enough.
therapy, they say.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a huge issue. And I wonder, so going back to the NHS needing to be this moral authority and needing to constantly assert that in order to get the buy-in of the people, like they did in these cases where it wasn't even just that the NHS wouldn't operate on these kids, they wouldn't even let them leave the country. Like, they forbid it. So they essentially blocked parents from being able to give their children a second shot, I wonder if that leaves room for the NHS to then start making decisions for parents about their children's transition. So like if a child starts talking at school about how they want to transition and be called different pronouns and a different name, and now they want to go on puberty blockers, like it does trouble me if the NHS has positioned themselves as the ultimate authority. It does worry me that they would start like going around parents' wishes.
They're already doing that. Rishi Sunak tried to, one of the good things he did, and he failed to do it, he tried to make sure that when a child says that they're transgender and reports it to a school authority, he wanted to make sure that they report it to the parents, which I think a decision like that should be reported to a parent. And under any other safeguarding thing, like if a child goes up to the teacher and says they want to kill themselves, for example, that would be, told to the parents. So why is this any different?
Yeah.
But he couldn't put that into action because of the UK Equality Act, which puts transitioning under a protected characteristic. So that law couldn't be implemented. And the same thing with Mermaids, they actually receive funding by the government. They receive grants by the government. They've been...
Why are they receiving grants by the government when it's so clearly a political
Because it's
group?
like a charity. There's like this massive charity complex in the UK. Where,
same here. But
yeah. Where it's just like these activists are going against like what the people generally want to push like this radical progressive agenda.
That's horrifying. This is the problem with taxation. Not only are they stealing your dollars, but they're sending it to organizations that are completely misaligned with your interests.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And Mermaids had a massive scandal where they were assigned, like they were giving out chest binders, which is also very harmful towards young women going through puberty.
Yes.
They were assigning chest binders without, like, behind the parents' back, and I think they were telling children, like, don't worry, you don't have to tell your parents and all that kind of stuff. And they're pushing forward these, like, medical treatments, like gender affirmative care and that kind of stuff towards minors. They're pushing for that.
This Mermaids group is?
Yeah, the previous CEO, Susie Green, she sent her child to Thailand who was like, I think 12 or under, to get gender reassignment surgery. And this is the woman running it. She has no medical expertise. She just has a trans child.
Isn't that, isn't that such a coincidence? I do think it's really important in these situations for people to understand, like, if you're concerned about these systems, like transing your kids, it's not enough to just fight against the activists that are doing it. You have to dismantle the systems that make it possible for the government or the state to do this to your child without your consent. Like, that happens in public schools, and with the NHS, like, it's now in danger of happening medically as well. Oh my gosh, that's so scary. That's so scary. That goes just beyond even like a long wait time, because obviously that's really terrible. Like, I think you wrote in this article for Fee that an elderly woman with a broken hip had to like wait on the floor of an emergency room, waiting room.
Yeah, there are many cases of that. Like, me personally, a recent experience I had was, and there's this like mentality around the NHS. I think it is quite sad, because when something's wrong, I just think I don't want to be adding to that waiting line when maybe someone who needs it more, will have to wait longer. So there's like sort of like guilt of even phoning up. A case of this is, for example, like my grandma. While she was alive, I remember her having like a certain sense of guilt, actually, even just calling an ambulance, because again, like, there's so many people who might need it more, and my mum would have to like nag her, and it's like, even if she's like fallen down the stairs or something, she'd feel bad. But it's like, even like, I remember my finger swelling up once, and I was just, oh, it'll be fine, just give it a few days. And luckily it was fine, but it could have been something serious. And a recent example of when I used the NHS, I phoned up 111, which is the non-emergency services, because I started to feel really dizzy anytime I stood up. And this was after, like, my boss told me, like, Jess, like, you need to do this. And I was just like, okay, like, it'll be fine, but I will call up. Because, like, I was feeling dizzy. It could have been something serious. And so I phoned up midday, and it was basically that they were reading off, like, a survey or something, which I probably could have done online. Like, that wasn't sufficient. And then they were like, okay, we'll call you back in, like, 2, 3, 4 hours. And I was just like, okay. And then I remember getting a call at 5 a.m. the following day.
Who is awake at 5 a.m.?
Yeah, literally.
That's crazy.
It was a woman, and she was quite rude, actually. I don't blame her, because she was probably a long day for her. But she asked the exact same questions. And part of me, she was like, is it urgent? And part of me was like, oh, no, not really, because I don't know what's going on. Like, you have no clue with healthcare. Like, something so small might be actually something big, and it's good people have them checks and stuff. But I didn't know what was going on. I was like, oh, not really, because I felt kind of awkward. I felt kind of guilty about it. And whereas if it was a family member, I would be like, go to the doctor, push for a GP. And so part of me was just like, I don't know. And she was just like, oh, then never mind then, don't, like, why are you bothering? she was pretty much saying. And then
but didn't you call the non-emergency hotline?
Yeah, she was just like, and I think this was like during like the end of COVID as well. So I couldn't even like go to a GP, because like a GP is also really hard to get to, which is a completely different thing. Like, you have to phone up in the morning, and if it's a non-emergency, they'll be like, oh, like next week. Or if it's an emergency, they'll be like, okay, we'll put you in a line. And that's just a completely different, another instance of like long waiting lists. But yeah, so part of me was like, I feel bad, I don't want to be like taking up time and resources. But then another part was like, I'm feeling dizzy, it might be an issue.
Yeah, it's scary, because a lot of those early warning signs, if you catch them then, it could prevent bigger things from happening down the road. So any system that like deprioritizes that is one that's going to create a culture of more unhealthy and sick people because people don't feel like they can go out and get those services that they need. What's really interesting, and you mentioned this earlier, is that a lot of the time, inefficiencies, long wait times, and other issues happening within the NHS are blamed on lack of funding, which I've noticed anytime a government-run bureaucracy has major glaring issues, people inevitably say it's underfunded despite funding being increased significantly over time, even more than like inflation is rising. So what do you think is the real problem with the NHS?
I think it is just a centralized, socialized system. That is the issue. It's the system itself, not how much funding. And also, may I add, like, a system that depends on a certain person or a certain group of people being in power isn't a very good system because, especially under democracy, when the leader's going to change, like, are we meant to accept, even if the Tories were, like, starving the NHS of resources, why is this a good system? Like, why would people be okay with this system?
Jess, that's an amazing point, actually. Yeah, like any system that's going to crumble because the population elected this slightly different leader is not.
Yeah, it's not a feasible system.
It's not one that we should be relying on. Like, we should have quality healthcare regardless of what's happening politically. Wow, that's an amazing point. Yeah, it's interesting because despite, increased funding over and over and over again, public education in the United States is exactly the same. It has a lot of big issues where I'm from. Louisiana is one of the worst states in the entire country for education, K through 12 education. And yet we pump thousands and thousands of dollars per student every year into public education. And I think it's maybe double what most people in the state spend on private education. So it's not that more money is going to make the system better. It's just that there is no competition or profit incentive to have faster wait times and, better healthcare in general. So, yeah, Jess, this has been amazing. We should definitely wrap up. Guys, we're going to have Jess on next week again, and we're going to have Olivia this time, and we're going to talk all things free speech in the UK. If you didn't know, the UK does not have free speech like we do in America. So I want to get into it, but before we leave, Jess, do you have any other words of wisdom or parting thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to bring up the issues of the UK because I remember being younger and I thought, there's no issues. Like, everyone's already talking about the issues like climate change and that kind of stuff. Whereas if you look deeper into the actual structure of the UK, it is the piece of legislation promoting wokeness with the Equality Act, the Communications Act, which I'm sure we'll cover next video, and also the Gender Recognition Act, or the levels of bureaucracy with the Quango state with non-profits basically lobbying the government. These are the real issues that people aren't talking about. Or the pension system, which is just a complete mess, and it means that younger people, our generation, will not receive a pension, but we're going to pay so much in tax. That's a massive issue. And I don't feel like enough people are covering these topics.
Absolutely. Yeah, like we said earlier, Jess is going to save the UK, so vote for her. Yeah, and where can we follow you on social media? I know you've produced a documentary before. You're running a lot of different social media accounts. So where can people find you?
Yeah, I think the best place to find me is probably on Twitter, Jess Gill 03.
Awesome. And you can follow me on Twitter at Liberty Anders. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and tune in next week with Jess and Olivia. And we will keep talking about the UK. Have an amazing week, you guys. Bye.